Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to finish our exploration of the Morgan affair. This series, of course, has been and is a little bit different. I'm trying to take a dry history and turn it into a relatable narrative. So far, we've had an overview. We've looked at Morgan and his perspective on the events leading up to the disappearance. We've looked at David C. Miller, the printer, and his perspective. We've looked at Samuel Green, the future anti-Masonic character who sets himself up as an unbiased witness. And we've looked at the Lodge, the Masonic members who are heavily involved. Not all of them, but many of the major contributors. And this has allowed us to see perspectives, to recognize that each person individually could well be said to have been doing what they believe is right, and they would have a solid argument for it. Morgan is down on his luck. He's lost all his work. He has no money. He can't support his wife and child, and he sees writing a book as the only possible source of income. Miller, equally down on his luck because of newspapers that come into Batavia that are run or backed by members of the Batavia Lodge, and he has an axe to grind with the Lodge for issues going back to an earlier membership, earlier initiation. Looks at Morgan's book and goes, "This may be what I need to get back on my feet." Same thing. Money is an impressive motivator, especially if you don't have it. Samuel Green sits here and says, hey, this is all very dangerous. He says he's passing warnings back and forth to Morgan and to Miller. He's simply not being taken seriously, and he's acting, in a proper way. The Masons, when you look at them individually, each one is basically seeing this as, we're not trying to do something horrible to Morgan, we're simply trying to separate him from Miller. The question of what happens to Morgan becomes the important part, because if he's murdered, yes, someone definitely crossed the line, but if they offer him money and he crosses the Canadian border never to be seen again, has anyone done something wrong? And that is the gist of the question. Each of these figures, everyone we've looked at, has some sense of plausible deniability. Some sense of, I'm doing the right thing for various reasons. I'm reminded of Roy Baumeister's quote, "The line between good and evil runs through the hearts of all men." No one, almost no one, leaving aside serial killers, does things just to be evil. And so that's why we're tearing this entire story apart. But today, what I want to do is focus on what may have happened to Morgan after he disappeared. Historians, both Masonic and secular or outside of the fraternity, have attempted to determine the truth of the events with very little success. Reverend Charles Finney, in his book, The Character, Claims, and Practical Workings of Freemasonry, published in 1869, recounts the tale of the confession allegedly given by the alleged murderer himself, Henry Valence, who apparently drowned Morgan in the Niagara River with the help of two accomplices. In a book, Low 12, published in 1907, it's claimed that Morgan was paid $500 and sent out to Canada or sent out of town. Some say he goes to Albany, others to Canada. Still others claim that he fled to the Cayman Islands, where he would eventually be hanged for piracy. There's a story that he ends up in Central America. There's a lot of possibilities. Most of these stories have very little evidence behind them. So, what do we know? Let's get into the material. It's not too difficult to discover that the Masons were concerned in Morgan's 125-mile journey to Fort Niagara. We know the Masons are involved at least to Fort Niagara. In January of 1827, 4 men, Edward Sawyer, John Shelton, Chesborough, and Lowton Lawson, were brought to trial in Canandaigua for having participated in the abduction. More than 100 witnesses testified, and although charges of murder were never proved, the 4 were convicted of kidnapping, a misdemeanor at the time. Again, that idea of kidnapping not being a huge issue. And sentences of imprisonment range from 1 month to 2 years. So let's look at the 2 main issues with Morgan, with what happened to him. Let's start with the assumption that Morgan is dead. How do we get there? So let's start at the jail. Morgan's protesting. He's screaming, "Murder, murder!" But Edward Sawyer and Chesborough descend upon him, silence him with a handkerchief stuffed into his mouth, and he's forcibly shoved into a carriage. It circles in the street in a fury, speeds away to the north. Morgan's hat lays discarded in the street. It's about 9 p.m. The moon is out. Brothers Lowton Lawson, Bredge Smith, John Whitney, James Gillis, and a couple of other Masons accompanied the carriage on horseback, or maybe in a second carriage. We're getting into witness accounts. Witness accounts are notoriously faulty. Morgan was bound to Fort Niagara near the Canadian border. They drove hard and whipped through the night. So they're pushing to get there. The horses and drivers are refreshed, several times along the route. They will meet up with Brother Eli Bruce, the sheriff of Niagara County, and Colonel William King at Youngstown on the evening of September 13. Morgan is hoodwinked and bound. King arranges a crossing into Canada with Brother Edward Giddens, a ferryman. They landed removed from any houses standing on the bank in the moonlight. Giddens and Brother David Haig kept Morgan at the ferry while King and Eli Bruce went into Niagara Village, so they've crossed the river. 2 hours later, they returned with 2 Canadian Masons, one identified as Edward McBride, a member of Parliament of Upper Canada. Again, government officials. Plans were made for Morgan in a few days after better arrangements had been made for his resettlement. So in other words, hey, come back in a few days, but now what are you going to do with Morgan? They returned across the river before dawn on September 14 and shoved Morgan put him up in an unused magazine, basically a storage room, which had been prepared for him at Fort Niagara 3 days prior, just in case. The fort had been deserted, so it's just empty. Edward Giddens acting as jailer. On the 14th, the following day, a Royal Arch chapter opens a meeting in Lewiston, bringing Royal Arch Masons from Rochester, Buffalo, Lockport, and the surrounding area. 48 hours into his captivity, with his fate uncertain, we are told that Morgan may have become hysterical. His actions were taken to silence him. Now that there just makes me nervous. Because when they say actions were taken to silence him, the most common thing that people do is shove something in someone's mouth. And the idea of suffocating on that, unknowing that this may happen, shoving it a little too far back into the mouth. Or maybe there's something that causes a reaction in Morgan or whatever else. I could definitely see a situation where Morgan dies in the cell unintentionally. And it would play along with the rest of the story. About midnight or early in the morning of September 15, 7 Royal Arch Masons assembled near a graveyard outside of Lewiston and determined to seize Morgan and drown him in the river. But en route to the fort, they came to their senses and dispersed. They go, you know what, we're not going to do that. Then again, in the evening of September 15, 4 Royal Arch Masons are alleged to have discussed executing Morgan, but without finality. Giddens pushes for Morgan's release, but King intervened. It was too late to release him now, he says. Criminal acts had already been committed. Giddens basically turns over the keys to the magazine to King and says, you know what? I'm not going to handle this anymore. I'm not going to be part of killing him. And we see this as a common theme here. These Masons go, yeah, let's do this. And then they get up to the moment and they go, no, this is just not the right thing. So Giddens gives the key to the magazine to King, who hands it over to brother Elijah Adams. Morgan, we believe, remained alone in the magazine through September 16 and 17. He may have been detained there as late as September 19, so 6 days in total in this storeroom. On the night of September 19, the anti-Masons allege, Morgan was rowed out into the middle of the Niagara River, so reports suggest, and drowned under a midnight moon. Now, I find that unlikely, because you're going to keep putting him onto boats, putting him into unstable circumstances where he believes he's going to potentially be killed, especially after being jailed, and you're telling me an accident didn't happen. That Morgan doesn't try and swim for it because he thinks that's his chance. That Morgan doesn't possibly die in the jail. How many people die in jails today due to mistreatment or neglect by the jailer or not knowing better? It's possible that he's dying having something shoved into his mouth. There's a lot of possibilities here before we jump to murder. And I'm not saying this to try and clear the Masons by any means. What I'm saying is, it seems like the more logical conclusion that something goes wrong at Fort Niagara, you do paddle out and you dump the body. Because this is going to be really hard to explain. Hey, we kidnapped a guy and he died. That no one's going to believe that, especially in the case of Morgan. But the longer he's there, the more likely something is to have happened. Let's say they do go out into the Niagara River and push him out of the boat. Is it possible? Absolutely. But given that everyone keeps backing out, I find that increasingly difficult to believe. But it is possible. We don't have a body. So it's, one of those things. It could have happened. I just find it a little bit hard to believe, given every other point of failure along this plan, that everything happens and they just go, you know what, after all this, we're just going to go ahead and kill him anyway. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So, there's a second theory, which we have discussed, the idea that he goes to Canada. And this is from John Whitney's testimony. As Whitney testified, it seems equally probable that Morgan took the $500 and set himself up in Canada and beyond. It's not unlikely that he deserts his family, seeing them as an unnecessary expense, a heavy weight that he's pleased to lose. But if he did disappear unwittingly, why did he remain silent? Because some things will happen after. In 1827, the governor of New York, past Grand Master DeWitt Clinton, had offered a reward of as high as $2,000, or about $80,000 today, for any information leading to the recovery of Morgan or the conviction of his killers. That'd be a heck of a payout at the time. You would think he would come forward. The governor even offers immunity for any accomplice willing to play ball, but no one comes forward, and that works both ways. There are reasons Morgan may have preferred anonymity. It was a time without networked communication. It's possible he'd removed himself far enough to be unaware of the fervor of the Fuhrer behind him. If he's in Western Canada, for example, does he actually know about the whole Morgan affair thing at a time that he can do anything about it? Perhaps he's delighted in the consternation his silence has caused. It's the fame that he always wanted. An accident could have befallen him traveling across Canada or setting up a new life. He could have been paid to remain silent. He could have waited too long and hoped that the bounty would increase, only to realize that no one cares anymore. He could have been told to wait until after a presidential election. The idea that the anti-Masonic party had a lot of power, and if Morgan shows up, then they lose all of their voice. And the trial for murder may have avenged him against those who had coerced his removal. There were strong influences pressuring him from both sides. We may never know what happened. One thing's for sure, though. Morgan left many debts in the shadow of his corpse, and to reclaim his name would have meant owning up to a life that he'd spent a lifetime running away from. He has a lot of debt, and if he turns up, yes, he gets to collect money, but there may be greater debts behind that. He'd also be obliged to resume his life, which means taking on the responsibility of his wife and his child. For the likes of William Morgan, it's just possible that he prefers being dead. Why go back to all the responsibilities when I can get a clean slate? For many people, that is a dream even today. And for him, it may have been offered to him. And this seems to make more sense. From my perspective, you may have a completely different view, and that's fine. But the idea that everyone goes, you know what, it's going to be easier to just get him out to Canada. And the Canadian brothers basically go, as long as he never turns up, it's fine. And that's what happens. He just vanishes from the historical record. He could have picked up a new name, new ideas, and everything else. And maybe at some point in the future, we find records of this. Someone leaves letters from a great-great-grandparent that happen to mention their relationship to the Morgan affair, and then we find out. But given the people that we've been dealing with, I still find it hard to believe that he would have been simply murdered in the middle of a river. Accidents, being sent across to Canada, all of these things, while they lack the spark of fiction that is so at the heart of the anti-Masonic Party, this idea that, oh my gosh, look at the evil, evil Masons, the corrupt Masons. Imagine how their life would have fallen apart if he turns up. You could even imagine a scenario where Morgan does turn up and goes, hey, I'm William Morgan, and some anti-Masons go, no, you are not going to be involved because you're going to destroy everything we've just built. Could you imagine that scenario? The anti-Masons themselves deal with Morgan. So there's a lot of possibilities. There is one loose end, though, to me, that needs to be dealt with. And this is the problem of Lucinda, Morgan's wife. Morgan goes missing. And I'm going to look at her deposition. This is taken from McCletchen's book, History of Freemasonry in New York, Volume 2, 474 to 477. On Monday, Morgan went into town. He doesn't return as usual for breakfast. He had gone into town. He's arrested. We know what happens. She doesn't. She was told he was forcibly taken and put into a carriage to Canandaigua. On Tuesday, the following day, she inquires with Sheriff Thompson and was told he was arrested and would be returned if she gave up to the Masons the papers in her possession. Now, I'm just going to stop there. Yes, this is her deposition. So this is her legal statement of what happened. But could you imagine going to a sheriff who goes, yeah, he was arrested, and instead of just going with the story that he would have had, that would have rattled off his tongue and sounded perfectly credible, instead he turns around and says, yeah, and we'll give him back if you give us the papers. That's James Bond villain type speak. That's not what you would expect here, which makes me question that, but I continue. He suggests, according to her deposition, that she take the papers to Morgan in Canandaigua. He also suggested she travel with a Mason, perhaps Mr. Follett. Later, Follett said he would not go unless he and another brother, Ketchum, could see the papers. Lucinda objected. She clearly knows that the papers are what they're after, and so let's not give them what they want right away, or I may never see my dear William Morgan again. And from letters and correspondences between her and Morgan, I find that a little unlikely, but that's all right. Let's continue. She finally agreed after it became clear that this is the only way to get William Morgan back. She was also concerned that if the papers were seen, they would be taken. After reviewing the papers, Follett and Ketchum agreed to take her. About 4 o'clock on September 12, they left and all stopped at a house in Stafford, where they are met by Ganson, who we've come across, and Daniel Johns, the Canadian, all of whom immediately examined the papers with much earnest. After determining that some papers were missing, probably the Royal Arch material, Follett backs out of the trip and says Ketchum can take her to Canandaigua. Ketchum then takes the papers with him and they set off. Johns rides with them to Leroy and gets out there. Ketchum and Lucinda arrive in Canandaigua around noon on Wednesday, September 13th. So Morgan's no longer there. Ketchum claims to be unable to get information from local Masons, fearing him to be a friend of Morgan. Ketchum leaves to make more inquiries with the papers, returning just before night, claiming Morgan had been taken to Pennsylvania on another warrant after having been released from jail. Well, that would be convenient and would fit with Morgan's previous arrests over the previous couple of months. Lucinda keeps asking for more information. Ketchum then opens up. He says Morgan would not be killed, that he would be held until they could get the rest of the papers, which is in line with what's happening at Fort Niagara. There were papers on the Mark Master degree still missing. He offered to take the papers to Rochester to discover more information on Morgan's whereabouts. He then gives her $2 and sends her back to Batavia. After offering Lucinda $25, about $1,000 today, to give him the missing papers if she finds them, and the lodge would give her another $100 if she could get what Miller has now. In other words, she's claiming that they're using her to get all of the papers. Lucinda turns down the money and says she would do nothing if he cannot find Morgan and let her see him. Which is an odd way of putting it, because it makes it sound like she believes that he's already dead. Now, Morgan had gone on benders in the past, had disappeared for a couple of days in the past, and so this is quite a reaction. Lucinda turns down the money. We talked about that. Ketchum also wants her to write if there's any, quote, rumpus about Morgan's disappearance in town. Lucinda again discusses her fear that Ketchum will simply abscond with the papers, to which he replies, quote, I promise before my God, I will not deceive you, but will do all I can to find out where he is and let you see him. He again urges her to find the papers. The papers taken were numerous and in Morgan's handwriting. And this is all from a deposition taken about 2 weeks later, September 26th of 1826. Afterwards, she more or less disappears, and it's unlikely she's corresponding with Morgan. It would seem that she accepts that Morgan is gone and the Masons are somehow to blame. Is that the most likely scenario? Possibly. Lucinda is also down on her luck. She's also trying to support people, and the Masons stepping forward, especially if they've sent him off to Canada, makes sense. Hey, we're going to take care of her a little bit. We're going to try and get this information. But again, it reads very one-sided. It reads as if the Masons are particularly desperate for these papers. If you've already separated Morgan and Miller, and they believe that most of their work is done, then why are they going to all of this trouble? It would seem that it would be easier to just sort of take care of her because we don't know where Morgan went, and so as a widow, let's just, make sure she's taken care of. But yet that doesn't happen. And especially if they feel guilty about the death of Morgan, you would think that might play in, but that doesn't happen either. It's not showing up. By the way, Lucinda is particularly problematic because she goes on to marry someone else, Richard Harris, and then may or may not have become one of the wives to Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormons. So very odd trajectory for Lucinda. And I say may have because historians generally don't agree on that fact. They don't agree that she marries Joseph Smith. There is a Lucinda Harris who is married to Joseph Smith, but again, this is possibly someone of the same name. It's not necessarily the same person. let's talk about this issue of the body. Obviously, with no body, there is no evidence. There is no murder. Not that there couldn't be. I mean, bodies disappear, but it becomes a difficult court case. In 1827, as the hysteria continues to mount and the accusations of conspiracy reach a fevered pitch, a decomposing corpse was found on the shores of Lake Ontario, not far from where Morgan was rumored to have disappeared. Was this the body of William Morgan? His widow initially claimed that it was. But when the wife of missing Canadian man, Timothy Monroe, comes forward and claims the cadaver was clothed with exactly the garments her husband was wearing when he disappeared, the discovery is quickly passed over. And I should note that there is rumor associated with this body that someone may have found the body, the actual body of Timothy Monroe, and shaved it to look like William Morgan. And there's some statement that this is a possibility. Lucinda could well have recognized it and gone, yes, that's Morgan, simply on the basis that it's a decomposing corpse. Every decomposing corpse looks more or less the same. You're not going to be able to tell who this is if they've been out there for a couple of days. So this would also not be the first time his body was, quote, discovered. In 1881, 55 years later, in a quarry near Albany, New York, a skeleton was found which reinvigorated the conspiracy theories surrounding the disappearance and alleged murder. So we find a skeleton. Of course, you can't really identify a skeleton, but several artifacts were found around it. Interestingly, a number of them engraved with the initials WM. So some proponents of the Masonic murder theory have insisted that the discovery was in fact the long-lost remains of William Morgan. Let me ask you this. From what you know of Morgan, of his impoverished state, what's the likelihood that he has a number of items, metal items, such as pocket watches, fobs, etc., that he's carrying around on a regular basis, engraved with his initials? Those would have been used to pay off debt long ago. So this is clearly a setup. However, the discovery was made just after the National Christian Association had commissioned a statue to commemorate Morgan's martyrdom, quote, to the freedom of writing, printing, and speaking the truth. And many wished to revitalize the conspiracy theories surrounding Morgan's disappearance, especially in the 1880s. Things had died out in the anti-Masonic party as we get into the 1840s, 1850s. The issues of the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, etc. will take precedent and move ahead. By the time we get to the 1880s, people see this as, hey, there's a lot of Masons coming out of the Civil War. Maybe we should reinvigorate the anti-Masonic party. This may have been part of it. So it's difficult, 100 years later, 200 years later now, to understand the extent and power of the widespread excitement and passions that this incident will create. For the fame and infamy of the Morgan affair spread over an immense territory. Much of the American East will be affected, as well as far as Ohio and other places. Many states see more than half of their lodges close. The membership declines rapidly. People try and bail out. It is the beginning of an anti-Masonic sentiment, which grew and spread like wildfire. Meetings were held. The order was denounced by press and pulpit. And anti-Masonic papers were started, with Thurlow Weed as editor, soon joined by the Anti-Masonic Review in New York and others. Of course, we know that David C. Miller will go ahead and start his own anti-Masonic newspaper. The many groups in Pennsylvania, for example, already opposed to any oath-bound society, such as the Quakers, Lutherans, Mennonites, Drunkards, Moravians, German Reformed Church, etc., were aroused to a high pitch of feeling against the alleged murderers and kidnappers, the Freemasons. This is one of those circumstances where the legend has become far bigger than the truth. Stephen Defoe, in his excellent study on the Morgan affair, takes the time to read through all of these witness accounts, all of the depositions, everything that's available about the Morgan affair. And even he has a hard time dealing with the fact that this is a lot smaller than what you would think. The most likely scenario is that separation, the idea that they're separating Miller and Morgan. Maybe something goes wrong on the kidnapping. But the idea that they push him off to Canada, where Daniel Johns is from, has several connections, could definitely put together a group of guys who are going to make sure that he moves further west, that he's away from any press or anything else, makes a lot of sense. But when we break it down, when you look at individual relationships, individual decisions, you'll see that when you remove the fog of legend, the truth is much smaller, much more mundane. We have an out-of-luck stonecutter representing himself as a Mason, possibly, assuming he is representing himself as a Mason, in other words, not actually being a Mason. He may be doing so to build up a business in a town that he's just moved into, and he sees this as a great opportunity. We have a printer who's down on his luck, who needs a big book. Morgan is offering that. We have Masons who are sitting there going, it's part of our obligation. We can't allow this sort of thing to happen. And for us to believe that, we have to believe that they have no idea that Samuel Pritchard printed the same thing, that the London Times printed the same thing 100 years earlier. I find that hard to believe. You're telling me none of these men, these learned officials, are aware of those books. We have a number of people making what appear to be somewhat reasonable decisions at the time. They could be threatening Morgan. They could be telling him, hey, we're going to kill you or whatever else, but no one ever really does. Instead, we hear from Whitney and others that he's offered this crossing into Canada, that he's offered this idea of separating. Lawton talks about separating him from Miller. Whitney talks about it. And so it all becomes a lot smaller. And that's the beauty of history. The more we get into it, the more we know. But at the same time, the more we understand the true scale of the reality of the Morgan affair. Now, that being said, it has a huge impact after. We have the anti-Masonic fervor. We have a presidential party that is developed, the anti-Masonic party. We have the idea of presidential conventions that come out of that party. Arguably, you have the birth of the Republican Party in part coming out of that, or at least that's been an argument that I've come across. You have a lot that comes out of this legend. A lot of people invested in maintaining the legend. And so it just grows and develops. And each of these figures, in their own way, kind of pushes that. Because everyone's looking at them as guilty or not guilty. They're not looking at them outside of that construct. They're not looking at them as individual humans making decisions for a variety of reasons. And so I hope what I've done in this series is given you enough information that you can look at the Morgan affair through fresh eyes, that you can start to maybe apply this to other parts of history and recognize that while the history may not always be as exciting, it does inform us about who we are. And the takeaway from the Morgan affair is the madness of crowds. You could definitely see a situation where everyone gets together, they get their energy up, we're going to go do this. And then at the last minute, when they're actually going to go, they go, no, I don't feel so good about this. That seems like the more likely scenario. When you are dealing with a big issue, an extraordinary claim that Morgan was murdered by the Masons, then you have to look for extraordinary evidence, and there is none. Hopefully, this has been enlightening. And thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lidke, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.